I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this symposia, and I'm very happy to be doing that. My title is Left is Not Equal to Right in the Human Brain, Brenda Milner and Hemispheric Specialization. And I'd like to start with just a few pictures of Brenda Milner. This is on her birthday, her 100th birthday in 2018. These two pictures can be found on the internet. The one in the center is from 1952, I believe, and on the right is from 1956. And this is how she was looking during the things that I am describing in a large part of this talk. And then there are just a couple of others, 1971, 1975, you don't find on the internet. So let's start with the road to hemispheric specialization. I'll give a very, very brief background of her education. In 1936, she entered the University of Cambridge, and from 1937 to 1939, she was supervised by Oliver Zangwill, who introduced her to thinking about the behavioral effects of brain lesions. So this was a very important influence on her. In 1939, she got her BA from Cambridge, and then initially she planned to do postgraduate research on how subjects behave in situations of sensory conflict. I tell you what she had planned because it's so different from what we know her for, but World War II intervened, and instead she worked on projects related to the war effort. Then in 1944, another important thing happened. She moved to Montreal with Peter Milner, who had a job or work that took him there, and she found work at the University of Montreal, so she worked in French. In 1946, she began attending lectures at McGill. This is while she was still working at the University of Montreal. She was excited by Donald Hebb's seminars where students were discussing his book, The Organization of Behavior, in detail while it was still a manuscript. In 1949, she began graduate studies with Hebb, initially to explore tactual concept formation in the congenitally blind. Again, not what we know her for, but in 1950, she got the opportunity to study Wilder Penfield's patients at the Montreal Neurological Institute. She changed her project for her doctoral work to investigating the effects of temporal lobe lesions in human subjects. Her background in experimental psychology stood her in very good stead for this work. It was the solid basis on which her career was built in the nourishing environment of the Montreal Neurological Institute. Her thesis was completed in 1952, Intellectual Effects of Temporal Lobe Damage in Man. Her way of thinking throughout her career, her approach, was evident already in her thesis. This included her reliance on data obtained from studies of other species, especially other primates, in selecting the first test that she would administer to her human subjects. In the first paragraph of her introduction, she explained why she chose to focus on temporal lobe patients. She said, "The clinical literature on the intellectual effects of human brain damage reveals a constant preoccupation with the problem of the role of the frontal lobes, with a corresponding neglect of other parts of the cerebral cortex. In particular, there is not a single systematic investigation of the effects of temporal lobe damage in man." The italics are mine. First, she discussed the literature on other primates and the existing data on human temporal lobes. It wasn't until just over a third of the way through the thesis that she brought up hemispheric differences. She said, "From this point onward, the effects of right and left temporal lobe damage will be treated separately. Firstly, because of the prevalence of language disturbances after lesions of the left temporal lobe, and secondly, because of the possibility, hitherto unproven, that right temporal lobe lesions may be more apt than left to cause deficit on certain non-language tests. This states a basic Milner goal, to uncover functions of the right hemisphere and to find how they differ from those of the left." Her reasoning was as follows. The absence of aphasia following lesion of the right cerebral hemisphere has led to a neglect of possible intellectual loss in such cases, and has probably encouraged the view that the right cerebral cortex plays an essentially ancillary role in intellectual functioning. It will be shown, on the contrary, that the evidence suggests that damage to the posterior association cortex on the right produces deficit different in kind from that caused by comparable damage on the left, rather than an attenuated form of the same disturbance. The data relating specifically to the right temporal lobe are unfortunately extremely meager. but they are completely consistent with the view just outlined. However, as in the case of aphasia, most of the clinical evidence comes from diffuse pathological processes. Her study differed from what had been done previously in several ways. Importantly, it was a systematic study. All of her patients were studied before and after a well-defined surgical lesion. This is as opposed to the diffuse pathology of the studies in the literature. Experimental subjects were temporal lobe patients, left ones, right ones. She had two control groups. First were patients with surgical resection from brain regions other than temporal lobe. She had left and right frontal and right parietal patients there. The second control group were convalescent non-neurological patients from another hospital, and these were tested twice in keeping with the pre and post-surgical testings of her experimental patients. She used 16 tests. This is different from the literature as well, where people tended to have just a few tests. Her tests were carefully selected to task functions that she predicted to be mediated by the non-dominant hemisphere, complex perceptual tasks. Thus, she included nonverbal and verbal tasks. In fact, she had 11 nonverbal and 5 verbal tasks. Her aim was to compare performance of temporal lobe versus frontal lobe patients and to compare left versus right temporal lobe patients. She had several important results. In the pre versus post findings, the most striking finding was the group with temporal lobe lesions, this was left and right combined in this case, showed certain specific deficits before operation, visual ones, and surgery intensified an already existing loss of function. This is very important, was unknown, and has been very useful in the clinical world. Temporal lobe versus frontal lobe. In general, areas of long-standing abnormality in the temporal cortex produced certain characteristic deficits. The temporal lobe group as a whole showed a specifically visual impairment. Then left versus right. She said, in addition, the right temporal group was inferior to the left and to the other subjects on certain tactual and visual tasks requiring the perception of spatial patterning or details. I'll show you an example from one of the tasks that gave these results. This is the McGill Picture Anomalies test. It consists of 34 sketchily drawn images like these two, which are part of the test. And subjects were supposed to indicate what was funny or out of place in each one. And to keep it as nonverbal as possible, they gave their answer by pointing or by circling what was out of place. In 1954, she published her first paper. This was in the Psych Bulletin. It was a comprehensive literature review taken from her thesis, and she finished it by reporting her own study. Her takeaway message in that paper was, any evaluation of human temporal lobe function requires a breakdown into left and right temporal lobe lesions. On the left, one sees language disturbances of varying severity, while on the right, there may be deficits of space perception, visual and non-visual. Memory was not the focus of the PhD thesis or of her first publication, but the same attention to hemispheric differences and the same careful methodology were used in her other studies, including memory and frontal lobes and others. Her next 5 publications addressed memory, but the 5th one also addressed an important new procedure, the Intracarotid Anesthetic procedure, or IAP. Its purpose is to determine cerebral dominance for language and to test memory function of each hemisphere independently. It was introduced in 1955 by June Wada, and that's why it's often referred to as a Wada test. In 1959, Milner designed a memory component, which became a part of the procedure. This was published in 1962. To give you an idea of how this procedure works, a barbiturate is injected into one cerebral hemisphere, briefly anesthetizing it and allowing the wake hemisphere to be tested alone. While the left is anesthetized, we test function of the right. While the right is anesthetized, we test function of the left. And this figure shows you with the 2 white hemispheres that they're functioning as they normally do. Then this line shows you a moment of injection when the drug is injected. And then this disables one hemisphere, which is shown in black. During the drug effect, simple speech and memory tests and some research tests are performed. And the drug wanes over time until for 6 or 7 minutes, the hemispheres return to baseline. At that point, baseline testing is carried out. The IAP has been an important clinical test in surgery for epilepsy for years, but it has also provided a rich opportunity for research. Milner and her colleagues and her students and other researchers around the world have piggybacked on this clinical procedure to study different aspects of cerebral dominance for speech and to explore the right hemisphere's special role in nonverbal and spatial functions. I'd like now to talk about some of the right hemisphere functions that she has found in different experiments, in different modalities and across the years. So let's look first at the auditory modality. In the 1960s, Milner and her then student, Doreen Kimura, studied healthy subjects with dichotic listening tasks. Here, competing verbal or competing nonverbal stimuli are delivered to the two ears simultaneously and putting the hemispheres in competition. Milner and Kimura showed specialization for verbal material, this was digits here, in the left hemisphere, and for nonverbal material, in this case environmental sounds and musical passages, in the right hemisphere. In the tactual modality, Milner's studies of Sperry's split brain patients also showed abilities specific to each hemisphere. A left but not right hemisphere failure in tactual form perception using wire figures gave further evidence for the greater special competence of the non-speaking hemisphere. This was published in 1972. And what happens here is that the split brain patients palpate one of these figures with one hand, and then they have to pick it out from the set of four with the same hand. They do not see the figures. With the left hand and the right hemisphere, they perform very well. They found it easy. But with the right hand and the left hemisphere, they failed miserably. Then in the visual modality, more evidence was accumulating over the years of the right temporal specialization for processing complex visual patterns. And an example we'll look at, patients with right temporal lesion failed to show a normal left visual field bias in a visual perception task. This was published by Kolb, Milner, and Taylor in 1983. Subjects are supposed to say which of these two lower faces most closely resembles the upper one. So the normal face that they see is above, and then the two left halves of the face are below, and the two right halves of the face are below. Healthy subjects and patients with left-sided lesions choose the one that's made up of the two left sides corresponding to a left visual field and to a right hemisphere advantage. Patients with right temporal or parietal lesions did not show this preference. And then finally, we'll talk about new methodologies. In the 1990s and the 2000s, Milner used functional imaging to delve further into different aspects of cognition. For example, an expansion of language studies in her imaging work with Denise Klein and others on cerebral organizations in bilinguals. All of her work has been guided by her adherence to the basics that she had set out in her PhD thesis: systematic studies, attention to results in other primates, comparisons between hemispheres, and the belief that the left and right hemispheres have different functions. In a variety of experiments over many years, she has successfully demonstrated double dissociations between the effects of left versus right-sided lesions and between skills and specializations of the left and right hemispheres, showing that in the human brain, left definitely does not equal right. So thank you for your attention, and I finish with some pictures of Brenda Milner.